Switch gears a little bit, another question here. Checking on all of your websites, listening to some of your speeches and addresses that you've made so far early in the campaign, the words federal overreach have come up. And certainly it's become a battle cry almost in the state of Alaska with some. Some Alaskans say the feds have way too much control over Alaska, especially when it comes to developing natural resources. But are lawsuits and continually pounding away at the federal government the way to solve this, or should another course of action be taken? And Mr. Sullivan, we'll start with you, sir.
Well, Steve, it's a great question. And I think the lawsuits have been effective. Let me talk about my record. As Attorney General in 2009, that was right when the Obama administration came into office, I saw the assault on this state. Resource development, roads, everywhere you look, they were coming after and trying to slow down or shut down our resource development, but regulate other aspects of our lives, not just our economy. And I thought it was critical that we stand up and we fight. And there are a lot of candidates in this race. Mark Begich, my fellow candidates here, talk about the importance of pushing back on the Obama administration. I have a record, whether it's going after the EPA. The Supreme Court heard a case that I brought when I was Attorney General just 2 months ago, suing on Obamacare, taking on the Department of Interior with regard to ESA, Endangered Species Act abuse, or the Arctic moratorium that they put on us in 2010 to stop drilling. I have a record of getting in the arena, battling this administration, and pushing back on the Obama administration's agenda, which has been shutting down our resources and our opportunities. One thing that I think Mark Begich has failed on, he has not used his leverage to get things done for Alaska. So we need to fight it from the state's perspective, but we need a senator who uses leverage to get things done for the state, and he has failed in that regard.
Mr. Treadwell?
You know, all three Republicans here want to redistribute power out of Washington. And the people in Washington, including Mark Begich, want to redistribute your wealth and your power back to Washington. And Mark has stood by idly, in my mind, while the EPA has come in and used a law that hasn't been used before to take your land, to take the value of our land that we got with statehood and make it not valuable to us. When the Obama administration cut the NPRA in half, this huge area on the North Slope, we were told we were a stakeholder. He didn't stand up for us. But let me just tell you the difference. I think that I would bring as a senator. All of us will pick up the phone. All of us will use our leverage with cabinet members much better than Mark Begich has. But I want to take the power away from the federal government. As Alaska's guy in the Arctic, Greenland, I've been to Greenland. They just got all their land from Copenhagen. The Northwest Territories on the 1st of April got all their land from Ottawa. There's bills that have passed the House that would give the Forest Service land back to Oregon. I want to bring the land and the control of the land back home to Alaskans.
Thank you. Joe? Mr. Miller?
Great question. We don't use the word federal overreach. We use the word soft tyranny. What the federal government is doing in this state is inexcusable. What you saw in Nevada just recently with the pushback on that ranch down there and the BLM gunning up, that's the type of soft tyranny, in fact, some would even use the words tyranny, that keeps this state down. The old ways don't work. This idea that we're going to file lawsuits with the judiciary that doesn't even respect the Constitution. Constitution has enumerated powers. I don't see an enumerated power that allows the federal government to hold the vast swath of land that it has in this state or in the other western states. The exciting thing about the time that we're at right now is that people are starting to recognize this. This is a mega shift in perception about the federal government. We had Obama shut down the federal lands with the government shutdown. People reacted to that saying, why are you doing that political action just to hurt the people? They started to scratch their heads and ask, is this the right thing for the federal government to do, to be in charge of all of these lands? Nevada also raised that same question. We as a people now have an opportunity with the likes of Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, Mike Lee, to push back in ways that we've never pushed back before. But you can't be compromised by the system to do it, and you've got to think broadly in new ways in order to put Alaska in the position that it was intended to be, and that is a very wealthy state based upon its resources.
Mr. Miller, thank you very much. Mr. Miller, we're going to let you, I think I got out of the order here, so I'm going to let you start off with that if that's okay. Women's issues, particularly abortion, are also on the minds of some Alaskans. George Taylor from Anchorage sent this question in. Recently, Congress has taken up the Life at Conception Act in the U.S. House. Would you support it? It's been introduced by Senator Rand Paul out of Kentucky, and it's also been introduced in the House as well. And it basically does what it says. Would you support that if you're elected to the Senate?
You know, that's one of the top priorities. In fact, the top priority for me right now is life. We have, Rand Paul has submitted a phenomenal piece of legislation which makes it a part of the federal law that life begins at conception, and therefore without the due process of law it can't be deprived. It's my commitment that if elected as your senator, that will be one of the first things that I do when I get to D.C. is co-sponsor that bill. Abortion is a plague upon this country. There's no question about it. We've now killed 56 million of our own fellow citizens. You know, you add another generation to that, it's tens upon tens of millions of people that could have, you know, first of all, we have all sorts of issues with Social Security. We have issues with our economy. It is something that this country must address soundly and firmly, and if it isn't done quickly, I'm very concerned about the future of this nation. So I applaud Senator Rand Paul for what he's done. I'm excited about the fact that we're able to move forward on that issue, and I'll do everything in my power when elected to make sure that that actually passes the U.S. Senate.
Okay, Mr. Miller, thank you. Mr. Sullivan, we'll go to you.
Steve, I'm pro-life, born and raised a Catholic, and I believe strongly, I think most parents do, you know, I'm a blessed man in terms of 3 teenage daughters, and you see the ultrasounds and the kids growing up. You understand the sanctity of life, and I'm very committed to that. I haven't read the bill, and one of the things that I just mentioned is as a U.S. Senator, before I opine on a bill, I'll read it, right? That did not happen with Obamacare. I'll read it. But you mentioned women's issues, right? And there are a lot of important women's issues. The one issue in Alaska that I've been proud to have spearheaded is we have a huge problem in Alaska with domestic violence and sexual assault. And that's our women, and that's our children. And as Attorney General, working closely with the governor, right off the bat in 2009, I spearheaded the Choose Respect initiative to bring those very high levels of domestic violence in Alaska down. And that, to me, when you talk about women's issues, is a social issue in the state that all of us need to focus on.
Okay, Mr. Sullivan, Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah, Steve, I don't think life is a men's issue or a women's issue. I think it's an issue for all of us. I have been pro-life all my life. I believe life begins at conception. And as your Lieutenant Governor and as a citizen before I was Lieutenant Governor, I worked hard to get the parental notification measure on the ballot. I helped raise money for it. I helped implement it. It would have been nice to have help from some of the other guys sitting right here on that issue as we've defended it. And the fact is that we now have a regulation and a bill that's just passed on medical necessity. So for the first time, Alaska may not be paying for abortions, and that's very important. And the issue of personhood that's in that bill, I, again, have not read the bill, but the issue of personhood is probably the next big debate in this country. And when does personhood begin? And I believe that if we're going to defend the rights of an unborn child, say from assault, when a pregnant mother is assaulted, I think we have to understand that the personhood begins at conception. And that's where I come from.
Okay. Steve, just real quick, just for the record, when I was Attorney General, I did defend the parental notification initiative.
Okay. Mr. Miller, anything else?
I just think it's important to note, I mean, this is a major issue. Life at Conception Act has been out for months. The fact that neither of my opponents are willing to stand up and say today that they'll support it, I think, is telling on this issue.
Okay. I beg your pardon. I will support legislation that supports life, the definition of life beginning at conception.
So you would support this bill?
I have not read that bill,
okay.
but you know, there's dozens of bills on this subject. And so,
yeah. Mr. Sullivan, you want to add anything else about this?
Again, like I said, as your U.S. Senator, I'll read legislation before I vote on it or opine on it.
Fair enough. And welcome back to Alaska Ask. I'm Steve McDonald, and we are joined by the 3 major candidates who are running for the U.S. Senate and the Republican side of the ledger. Joe Miller, Dan Sullivan, Lieutenant Governor Mead Treadwell. Thanks very much for being here with us. We are hearing Alaskans ask these gentlemen ask questions about top issues facing Alaska and, of course, the United States. This next question comes from a UAA student and focuses on the National Security Agency. Here's the question.
Our technology is increasing the ability of the government to keep tabs on us. So my question would be, what level of surveillance would you consider to be constitutional for, say, the Department of Homeland Security or any other government agency for that matter?
That student's name is Lowell Perry. He's an electrical engineering student, a junior over at UAA. And Mr. Treadwell, we'll start with you on this particular question. What do you think about this?
Lowell, thank you for your question, and I think this is one of the most important issues in this campaign. I'm going to say first and foremost, I believe government's job is to protect your rights, not to take them away. And the second thing I think we all have to remember is the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. That's what you're saying on email. That's where you are. Against unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated. And if the government wants to do it, it needs to get a warrant. I don't believe in secret warrants. I believe the government needs to get a warrant. And the fact is, I'm astounded that Homeland Security, with a straight face, said, let's have a network to figure out where everybody's license plate has been. That's not their business. What they've done with the phone records, what they're doing with the email, makes no sense. The post office can't figure out whether to deliver mail on Saturdays, but they somehow can take a picture of your mail coming and going. And we have to call a halt to this. I'm for defending the country, and I'm certainly for making sure we don't have other terrorist threats to the United States, but I don't believe we should be giving up our freedom to do it.
Mr. Miller?
Can't agree more with Lieutenant Governor Treadwell. The fact of it is that the Fourth Amendment is under violation with the surveillance state. And I think your viewers need to understand that the whistleblowers that have come forward over the last several years suggest, I think with a high degree of reliability, that almost all digital communications, that means cell phone traffic, is probably recorded and stored. It doesn't mean there are analysts out there listening to it all. But this is atrocious. It's precisely opposite of what our founders intended for our government to do. The Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable search and seizure, but it's not just the warrant issue, because the warrants have to issue. It's also an issue of the will of our federal government to actually address these issues of domestic terrorism. The fact is, the will isn't there. When we have borders that are not secured, that's the #1 way to prevent the domestic issues that come here. And yet, we have a porous border. If we were serious about addressing the issue, we wouldn't be growing tyranny, which is what we're doing by allowing a federal government to know everything and anything about us. Instead, we'd be addressing some of the root causes. I think it's very important that we evaluate exactly where we want to be as a nation and whether or not we want to empower a government like what we have currently under the NSA and under the entire collection of intelligence agencies.
And Mr. Sullivan?
To me, the key issues are we need to be focusing more on the bad guys and less on the good guys. We're the good guys. The people living in America, right? We're the good guys. And with regard to this issue, it has to be whatever the activities of the federal government firmly rooted in the Constitution. I carry the Constitution around on the campaign trail. I read it. I had a good discussion. You know, Joe talked about Senator Lee, sitting down with Senator Lee in Washington, going over provisions of the Constitution. Everything we do has to be based in that great document. And that's the key to the NSA overreach. But it's not just the NSA. Right now, under this administration, we have federal agencies that are literally running amok. We have had EPA agents armed, drawing down on law-abiding Alaskan citizens. Got to stop that. We've had IRS agents targeting different political groups for their political beliefs. That is not what we should be doing as a federal government. And we need a senator in the U.S. Senate who is watching over these agencies. Mark Begich has not been doing that, and that's another way in which he is undermining the interest not only of Alaskans but Americans.
Okay, thanks very much.
You know, I think it's important, too, that we not have a senator whose campaign is being funded by the architects of the surveillance state, such as John Negroponte, who's a personal donor to Mr. Sullivan's campaign, former head of the Director of National Intelligence. When we're talking about getting care of this problem, we have to have people with backbone. The security agencies in this country are exceptionally powerful, and they will do and say anything, I think, necessarily to continue to expand this power. This is a freedom and liberty issue. It's critical to the future of this country, and it has to be addressed with a backbone of titanium.
I could get into all sorts of details, but my point is this. If you haven't read George Orwell's 1984, reread it.
Okay.
Read it or reread it. We are in a surveillance state that's like that novel. It doesn't, I didn't want to live in that novel. I don't want to live in a country that treats your privacy so cavalierly. That's why, as head of the Aerospace States Association, I said we're not going to have an industry with drones unless we protect privacy. I'm glad our legislature's addressed that issue, and I've been a national campaigner on that.
Okay, and we'll give you a final word here on this, Mr. Sullivan.
Security should not be the excuse to undermine liberty.
Okay.